Welcome to the Randy Burke channel. I am Randy Burke. Today, I would like to introduce to you, The Cherry Bomb Has a Short Fuse, by WaddleBuff. About the story, despite his commitment to Asuna, Kazuto can't stop thinking of Sinon. As Kirito or otherwise, his mind is filled with her, an itch he can't scratch. Fortunately, or unfortunately, she feels the exact same way. And it doesn't take long before the Bob Victors come up with the simplest, most logical solution to their problem. They decide to fuck a lot. The cherry bomb has a short fuse. The bullet of bullets was over. The whole mess with the red-eyed freak mopped up. Life supposedly went back to normal, as it was before the killings, the bloody ghosts of jeering caskets. And yet, Kazuto Kirigaya still felt uneasy. He felt that creeping shadow over his shoulder, like death during the Sao incident, or lives lost to those phantom bullets. He didn't know what that unease was, what feeling it was that made him feel so icky. But what he did know, was that it was because of her, Sinon. No, not Shino Asada, the girl he saved last week. She was doing swell. They were both doing swell, all smiles when they would meet in the real world. Not a care the world. But Sinon, her avatar, the girl she would turn into when transported to the world of Gungale. That's another story altogether. In the times Kazuto would deep dive, and catch sight of that hair, lock eyes, see the line of her mouth that plagued him in his sleep, he felt that unease worse than ever. And he could tell that unease, that tension weighed heavily on her as well. When they were at a point of comfortable intimacy a mere week or so ago, they were now a little awkward. Conversations shared in the digital cafes before they would go for casual raids were stilted. Walks through the neon-lined streets of the city were dreadfully silent. And worst of all, whenever he looked at her and noticed how her skin glowed ever so dimly in the sickly light of the sky, how her lips formed when she said his IGN, his mouth would prickle. It prickled and numbed, it festered. It kept festering, ever since that moment in the cave during the final leg of Bob. Away from the sight of the broadcasting surveillance drones. After all of the bonding they had done, opening up of their insecurities and anxieties, Sinon had leaned up to his face, and planted a solid kiss on his lips. It burned. Hot and vivid, like touching Asuna's breasts for the first time in the cabin all those eternities ago. And then it ended. And her eyes were the closest they had ever been to his, making his head spin and spin and spin. And Kazuto's mouth felt rotten. The danger and immediate threat to Shino's life had thankfully taken his mind off of it. And fortunately seeing her real-life counterpart didn't trigger anything in terms of that attraction. But now, it came back in full force. It tingled, it itched, like some sort of sensory glitch in Kazuto's atmosphere. Desperate, in the days following, Kazuto passed it off as just that, a glitch, even if it followed him IRL. He tried his best to wipe it off, to scratch it. Like one night where he called Asuna over when the apartment was empty, seizing her mouth roughly, almost ripping off her sweater, her bra, sucking on those breasts he had once found so enticing and sweet. Yet as he kissed her naked skin as she writhed in protest, moaning as she clutched the carpet of his living room, Kazuto couldn't get rid of it. He couldn't scratch the itch, he couldn't rip the rot off of his mouth. He suckled on her bud, feeling the heat of her inner thighs clenching around him, kept delving his tongue deep into her with no intent of love or intimacy, just to feel good and distressed, swallowed at least 3 of her body-racking peaks, but nothing. So he took her, then and there. With their clothes still bundled around their limbs, they fucked. Furiously, with the fervor of his time as the Black Swordsman, cleaving through high-level cronies, Kazuto took her. He took her harder than he ever had, reaching his peak several times onto her stomach, spilling onto her smooth back, inside of her hot mouth, doing so multiple times into her stifling heat. They ended up on the bed, sweaty and spent, Asuna cooing banal truisms of how much she loved him, how much she missed him, how she loved it when his body made love to hers. And lying there, covered in his girlfriend's essence, sweat, and his own seed, Kazuto could only stroke her skin absent-mindedly, and feel the frustrating throb of his lips, festering, festering, festering. After all he did, he knew there was one thing he could try. One thing he dare not try, as if it were a rite, a séance IRL, a temptation from hell. He would have betrayed her, the woman he loved, he would have betrayed the trust of her forever, or would he? After all, it wasn't like he did it for real. It wasn't like the world on the other end of a deep dive was reality. Sinon herself had said that he treated both worlds, physical and digital, as reality. Maybe it was time to distance himself from that mindset. Because the rot on his lips was only getting worse. So it was after a raid when he couldn't keep his eyes from Sinon's pert ass that he did it. Once they reached the city limits of the SBC Glaucon, he pulled her aside through a few dingy alleys, leading her hurriedly by the hand. She silently followed, obedient. A motel. Crummy, as all things were in Gun-Gale. But it would do. He locked the door, Sinon's eyes wide, cheeks blushing, but nothing in her hands or on her lips raised in protest. Yes, this crummy motel would do nicely. And he took her. He answered the sinful calls of that hell over his shoulders, and his lips were on hers. Kazuto could swear that his lips IRL were puckered too, because he kissed her harder than he had ever kissed Asuna. His tongue delving virtual spittle across her lips, his hands finally groping Sinon's ass with reckless abandon. She kissed him back, touched him back all the same, and with a few touches of hovering keyboards they were in their undergarments, and then they were naked. A tangle of limbs, they fell onto the sheets of that crummy motel, and Kazuto took her, letting his itching lips suck out her essence to his heart's content, cramming his tongue into her snatch, lathering her skin. Thoughts of Asuna were buried under the unrelenting waves of satisfaction that night as his avatar's long hair stuck to his back in virtual sweat while his hips heaved with desire-addled effort. His HUD flashed several times with an overactive BPM alert that he continuously disregarded as he spilled lust and release into the willing receptacle of Sinon's womanhood, and the programmed springs of the bed squeaked and groaned. They kept going until their raised BPMs from sensory overload prompted their atmospheres to finally log them out. Kazuto's lips stopped itching. The devil had his due that night. Now, Kazuto felt the festering everywhere. All over his chest, his thighs, his lips, and, especially, in his hands. It was a few days after that night in the digital motel. He had woken up, torn off his atmosphere to find his joggers completely ruined, stained. That shouldn't have been possible. There were a few VMAs out there that were dedicated for the sole purpose of emulating sexual experiences, where you could win over any dream girl, even design them for your sick pleasure. But as with all the sensory programming of the atmosphere, none of it, no matter how much simulated carnal pleasure you'd have, you wouldn't have reached those highs IRL. But he shoved that aside, just as he shoved the appointments he had with his friends over in Alfheim, the date he had with Asuka that day. He locked his doors, eager as a kid who had a nerved gear for the first time during its release. Frantically he situated himself on his bed, almost panting. One full dive later and Kazuto, the guy who was dating Asuna IRL, was no more. He was Kirito, the guy who got to fuck Sinon as much as he wanted. He stood near the door of the crummy motel room where he and Sinon had first consummated their mutual lust. And consummated it again. And again. This was their fourth time in the motel together, and he knew it wouldn't be their last. A few seconds passed. Kirito grew impatient. Then, in a shower of pixelized blue, Sinon spawned. She looked at him, and smiled. It was a smile that Kirito would never have imagined on a girl like Sinon. Someone who was so stoic at her best, and genuinely vulnerable at her worst. In contrast to her usual self, the smile that curled on those lips denoted power. Power with the knowledge that her body drove Kirito positively batty, leaking with mischief, drenched with want. The effect of such a deadly smile only triplicated when she bit her lip. Wait for me long? Too long. One stride later and his lips were on hers. Absolute electricity. He breathed in deep, his nostrils filled with the scent of honeysuckle and gunpowder. There wasn't too long of an exchange before they separated, eyes entwined as interfaces popped up before them, their fingers plucking on holographic screens. Their clothes vaporized, leaving them in undergarments. Sinon gave him that smile again, as Kirito's eyes drank her in. If there was in-game damage from their previous trysts, the milky skin of hers would be stamped with marks from his teeth. He unclenched his hand, taking the hairband he had extracted from his inventory. Soon enough his waist-length hair was done up, unable to interfere in anything he was going to do to the girl who slowly stepped backwards with that teasing smile on her lips. It only took another long stride and his mouth was on hers, hungry. Heat blossomed from their connection, burning into Kirito's lips, spreading across all of his skin. The festering disappeared. His hands once again clutched onto her soft, pert ass. The fire quickly concentrated in a furious boil in his groin. Her kisses were like a sacred balm, and he was for damn sure going to drink every last drop. Kirito's senses and his mind completely forgot the fact that this was only a digital dream, that the lips he suckled on were just succulent lines of code, that her heat were just electrical impulses sent through his IRL counterpart's nervous system. He didn't care, all he cared about was how good Sinon tasted, how good she felt against him. Fortunately, Sinon felt exactly the same as he. For the entire day, she went through the motions of the IRL reality, biting her lip, daydreaming of Kirito using her body, making her senses go absolutely rampant with carnal pleasure. Now that she was here, she would let him take her in any manner he pleased, as long as he let her touch him in any manner she pleased. Though his avatar's frame was thin, without any clothes, there was clear definition all over his body. Solid, angular muscle that Sinon's hands reveled in touching, in gripping, in palming. Her soft touch made Kirito's touch that much rougher, his kisses following suit. His tongue shoved itself past her lips, welcomed by her own in a hot wet swirl. Their kisses resounded in delicious smacks as their bodies pressed together, fabric frustratingly keeping their cores apart. Kirito pushed them forward together in a sultry dance, feet moving in small shuffles until there was a jolt once Sinon's ass made contact with the room's cheap entertainment system consisting of a small wooden cabinet and an ancient CRT television. With his prey cornered, Kirito's hands smoothed up the silky skin of her back. Once making contact with her black bra, his fingers fiddled to find the clasp before promptly grabbing it, and deftly tearing it off. There was a small digitized spark, leaving Sinon's bra hanging loosely. It didn't hang for long. Another deft grab, and Kirito threw it onto the ground, pushing his chest into her perky tits, grinding his skin into her pebbly pink nipples. Sinon mewled at the sensation, contentedly poking her tongue pointedly into his mouth. The action had them open their mouths for a few moments, letting out strands of saliva to dribble between their chins, but soon Kirito's hand found the back of her head, and he ensured that the rough fucking of tongues continued. He was never as grateful to the programmers as he was now. Sucking, gulping in Sinon's essence, how amazing it was that he could keep his tongue and his lips pushing against hers without the need to take a breath. Sure, the system would simulate a feeling of suffocation, a sort of compressing feeling around his lungs, but it was nowhere near the real sensation of being breathless. The worst that could happen was their life bars would deplete, ever so slightly, but even then it would take at least a few minutes of their intense making out before even that became an issue. So, Kirito took full advantage of it, his right hand keeping her head in place as she delightfully parried and wrestled everything his tongue did between her cheeks. He swallowed every muffled calling of his name, every moan as his free hand slipped between them and palmed her supple breast, but he wanted more. That same hand slipped down the smoothness of her tight, athletic stomach, before sliding into her panties. As expected, Sinon was soaked. His fingers immediately formed the designated formation, middle and ring finger tightly bound together, index and pinky giving them plenty leeway to do their work, and thumb ready to flick and play with her swollen clit. Not another second passed, and Kirito began shove his fingers into her, feeling just how wet she was, how impossibly tight her inner pinkness was. Sinon groaned, trying to break free from Kirito's mouth, but his hand held her steady, held her captive. He bit her bottom lip as a punishment, and in return he drank in a squeal as his thumbs simultaneously swirled at her pink bud. That was it, more of her vocal nectar for him to gorge on, while his touch effortlessly drove her mad. She came, convulsing in writhing, desperate undulations that made the wood behind her creak. Her keem leaked out in thick strings of cloudy white, staining Kirito's hand, soaking into her panties as she clutched onto him for dear life. Her inner grip grew tighter, wetter around him, but he didn't stop, and his thumb merely kept assaulting her clit, pushing and toggling for all it was worth. Kirito loved this, loved how helpless she was as she succumbed to more waves of orgasmic bliss, eagerly pushing his lips as close as they could go, their teeth kissing as he devoured her mouth with his jaw widening, gulping in all of her wanton moans and pleas. But by her third orgasm, with her keem leaking down her thighs, and Kirito's cock strained against her stomach, he wanted more. He loved muffling her squeals, feeling them reverberate down his throat. But now he wanted to hear them, he wanted to hear her scream his name. With increased vigor, Kirito finger blasted her harder, the sound of his hand schlicking and sucking into her needy pussy loudly echoing between them now as Kirito's lips slipped, a squeal escaping with the foamy lines of saliva that leaked down her cheek. He started curling his fingers, scraping out hot sparks of pure pleasure, making her arch her back into him as she came again, shuddering in breathless convulsions. As Sinon came down from her climax, hiccuping nonsensical pleas to him as her body shivered hotly against his touch. She took her first breath in minutes, then, prying free from Kirito's mouth once his hand stopped clutching the back of her teal hair. He reached over her shoulder as she caught her breath, and with a swift swing of his arm, cleared the entertainment system, the CRT television crashing to the floor. There was a harsh smash of the television shattering, followed by the tinkle of glass before the entire thing faded into worthless pixels. With the wooden surface cleared, Kirito went to work. No sooner had Sinon registered what had just occurred with the television behind her did Kirito's hands gruffly grab the fabric of her panties, bunching it in his grip and ripping them down her smooth legs. Sinon mewled, a mewl that turned into a squeal once Kirito's hands grabbed her bare ass, lifting the weight of her entire body the moment she kicked away her damp panties. Her vision, already blurry with tears from being bombarded with sensory stimulation, turned into another blur as Kirito repositioned her, slamming her onto the now empty entertainment center. Kirito beheld her then, panting as he drank in her curves with eager eyes. She was bare, naked, and vulnerable for his touch. Her skin practically shone in the lamplight, her labored breathing bringing attention to those breasts of hers that seemed to be the perfect fit for his hands, her squirming deliciously worming through the womanly curves of her waist. Her legs shifted, thighs sliding against each other, almost shyly. But Kirito knew it was probably just from the sudden shock of being slammed onto the wood of the entertainment center. After all the things they had done in the past week, there was no way any shame still existed in this girl's head. In only a few seconds, he drank in enough he needed to touch her now. He didn't give her a chance to look up at him, didn't even let her fully recover from the chain of orgasms that still made her avatar heave with breath. Instead, he parted her legs, the milky skin of her thighs acting as silken paths to the invitingly moist and hot lips of her eager pussy. Kirito licked his lips at how bare her crotch was, how wet her pink lips looked as they glistened for him. With that, he dove forward, and his tongue delved inside her. Sinon's hands immediately found his hair. Kirito's hands immediately shot to her breasts. With the assault on her senses closing in on her on two fronts now, Sinon could only whimper, mewl, squeal once Kirito began eating her out in earnest, the sinful movements of his tongue coaxing out lust from her inner folds in a way that felt much more raw and intimate than the coaxing he had done with his fingers. Kirito knew this would drive her absolutely mad, and signs of that were already prominent mere seconds into his oral assault. Her back arched every time his lips brushed against the swollen nub of her clit, her fingers gripped to his hair in tight bunched-up fists, her legs wrapped around his head to engage him in a lewd and heated hug, and her lips, now free of the gag of his tongue, kept moaning and moaning and moaning. "Hey Kirito, NNNGH." Sinon squealed, eyes squeezed shut at just how much he overworked her senses. She pulled at his hair with enough force that she was sure the blocky pixels of red damage markers would begin to bubble from his scalp. Unfortunately for her, due to the tight binding of his hairtie, she wasn't able to hold on as strongly and as tightly as she'd like, especially when, only a minute or so into Kirito's devouring of her needy snatch, Sinon came. Her keem spurted directly onto his tongue in hot, viscous jets. He swallowed eagerly, as if thirsty for her. His tongue kept swirling, lips sliding over her clit with intent as it kissed his teeth. She tasted so fucking good. Her essence flooded his mouth and he would swallow every last morsel. This was a luxury his lust had refused to afford him in nights prior. Every other night, when they stripped down to their undergarments, it had always just been a vigorous make-out, violent petting, and straight-to-mattress creaking, nerve-melting sex. Now that they were familiar with each other's bodies, and just a little less pent-up, Kirito would make sure that his tongue was very acquainted with her by the night's end. The reasons? Mainly two. 1. Chino was a virgin. Kazuto could tell in the way she handled Sinon's body, how timid she was on the first night, and now, on the fourth night, how she thought the only way she could reach the peaks of pure pleasure was through a good railing. So now, as his mouth and hands lavished her avatar's body with the grace and passion of a master sculptor, he would show her that he could pleasure her, unwind her, break her with his mouth and hands alone, an IRL skill that no player in GGO or anywhere else could truly learn through digital skill sets alone. 2. Sinon's body was delicious. If Kirito was honest with himself, he wanted her ever since the first day they met, when his eyes had a taste of her tight, athletic curves when she mistakenly thought his avatar was female too. And now, with her naked under his grasp, that body was his to completely taste directly, with his fingers, his lips, his tongue. It was different from drinking in her body as he fucked her, it was more personal, more intimate. And it excited him more and more as the minutes went by. His hands continued to roam every inch of Sinon's nakedness, and, as he intended, it drove her mad. Sinon's mind was filled with the pleasure Kirito flooded her with. How was this possible? With just his hands and his mouth, he had already made her come more times than she could count. She began to protest when he kept feasting, kept on drawing delightful shapes inside of her, easily making her entire body rock with pure carnal bliss. She could only come again when she felt his lips curl into a smile on her clit. Kirito savored this. Every twitch of Sinon's body merely made his tongue more eager, more vigorous in his movements. He was going to fuck her silly, but not yet. For now he had every intent to make this girl squeal as he made Asuna squeal IRL. Scream his avatar's call sign like his girlfriend would scream his name when she would come around his tongue just as Sinon was doing. So Kirito feasted. Her keem overflooded his lips, leaking out onto the entertainment center's wooden ledge, dripping in cloudy streams onto the muddled carpet. His tactile appreciation of Sinon's body went on, unrelenting for minutes, wet sounds of his tongue and his mouth slurping up the very essence of her lust echoing and sandwiching between her desperate squealing and whimpering. And by the umpteenth orgasm, Kirito's savorous patience finally wore thin. His hands were at her hips, his thumbs drawing fleshy circles into her skin when Kirito withdrew from her pussy's soft lips. He panted at the sight, breathing heatedly against the inside of her thighs. Thighs that he marked with his teeth in a rough bite, red highlighted with the clearness of his spittle when he licked over it. He stood, letting Sinon rest for a bit. Sure, physical stamina was pretty much unlimited in Jijio, as it was with every other VMO, but mental stamina was of limited supply. And she was going to need plenty of it for what Kirito had in store for the rest of the night. Sinon lolled her head about on the hard wooden surface below her head. It all felt too good. Never in her life had such pure, unbridled carnal pleasure crashed through her as it did that night, ripping through her body in violent, cresting waves. She felt the simulated coolness of the air conditioning prick at her skin, also made aware of the puddle of her cream that leaked over the edge of the table she lay on. She panted, mostly out of mental reflex and instinct and anything. She fully expected Kirito to continue his assault, but fortunately for her fortitude, he was finally letting the stimulation of her body rest. The next time she looked up, when her heart's pulse had relatively steadied in its beats, her eyes widened. Kirito was looking down at her with a fierce glare, like she was a slab of his favorite cut of steak. His prick like the veiny table knife that stood at full attention, erect, throbbing, with a drip of pre-cum anticipatedly clinging from his urethra, ready to cut right into her pink flesh. She bit her lip excitedly, digital sweat rolling off of her nipples as she sat up, supporting her weight on her elbows. When she made full contact with his eyes, the lip bite turned into a pouting scowl. You didn't need to do that, you know," she said, her eyes as cold as they were when they first met. "It's not IRL, I'd much rather you." Sinon's words trailed off, and she found herself breaking away from his gaze. But Kirito would have none of it. "Rather have me what?" Kirito said. "No," growled. The tone of his voice surprised her, more so than the way his hands gripped her thighs, her calves limply hanging over the junction of his elbows. This was unlike him. The normal Kirito she talked to, the kind and somewhat dorky Kirito. No, this was still Kirito, but a side of him that she had seen only during the Bullet of Bullets. The Kirito that was determined for victory, for total submission of the opposition they faced. As she gazed upon him as he stood there, intimidating and ferocious, she felt that this was who people meant when they referred to him as the Black Swordsman. The fierce look in his eye, if this was a tournament or a serious battle, if he had that look, Sinon would know that he was out for blood. Sinon blushed, sincerely. As much sex as they had, he never looked at her so seriously. She bit her lip again as her eyes fixated on his thick and pulsing lust, letting out a breath when its engorged head pushed against her slick folds. Her nails dug into the wood below her in a tense grip. "You know a Euro broken bar," she said. She gasped as Kirito pushed forward with a grunt, successfully cramming the first few inches of his cock into her clamping snatch. "Let's say I don't, Sinon. Even though out of the both of us, you're the most likely to be clueless about these things, seeing how you're a virgin." Hey, that's not, ang. Another few inches. With their connection, she could already feel the throbbing of his meat, reverberating fleshy resonances against her suffocating pocket. She was flustered as she was horny. Now, Kirito had never brought up the IRL during their previous trysts. She knew about Asuna, of course, knew that what they were doing was, well, questionable at least, so she thought the lack of bridging the two realities was something he didn't want. It certainly wasn't something she wanted. And the fact that he was bringing up her non-existent IRL sex life left her reeling. It felt so wrong now, but, answer me, Sinon. You'd rather have me what? Do you really enjoy me stuffing my cock? Kirito pushed forward again. He was almost hilted. Into you that much? That you want me to fuck you more than me eating you out? Odd how horny you are when you've never even seen a cock on the other side of a deep dive. Sinon clenched, reveling in the filling sensation in her core. This was what she wanted. This was what she fantasized during lonely nights offline. What she had been thinking about every hour of the day IRL. Kirito's teasing only made her more aroused, addled by how naughty she felt whenever he mentioned Sinon. How she never had sex, how he was pretty much the first sexual encounter he's had even though it was in a game. But eventually, the dirtiness, the arousal, all of it began to accumulate and pool over the rim of her cup, and Sinon's titillation turned into irritation. Mostly because he was right. He hit the nail on the head on everything he just said, but hit the center of the bullseye on one particular thing. At this point, she just wanted his cock. Her body rocked forward when Kirito finally gave one last thrust, clenching tight onto the meat of her thighs as he hilted himself. He stayed like that, chuckling at the way his full insertion made her moan, how his words had brought the blush out to pepper her cheeks, melting her cold demeanor completely. He knew she would never be that Sinon to him ever again. The Sinon that was impartial and calculating. No. She was his now. And the only side of Sinon he'd see when they were alone was this one, vulnerable, hot, needy, wanting. It was the best, and the only way all of that could be better is if she said it. Admitted the desire in her body, the desire for him. So, am I right? Not a moment later. God damn it, Kirito, yes, please just fuck me. Sinon said, spitting out the words in a daze, desperate and frustrated and angry. I want your cock, damn it, I finger myself IRL just thinking about it, so please just fuck me. The dirtiness of the IRL mentions was forgotten, the brief flash of guilt in her system completely stamped out. She played into his hand, and all she cared about now was that he shut up and fill her up, just the way she loved it. With an absolutely evil grin, Kirito obliged. Within seconds, Kirito was dragging his cockhead out and plunging back into her in a cycle of unfettered pounding. His hips rolled viciously. Over and over he became willing victim to the heat that sucked his engorged prick inside of her, gripping with a fleshy hold that shot lightning through his nerves. His fingers dug into the softness of her thighs as Kirito's eyes drank in every detail of the scene before him. He wantonly ran over the curves he had just finished groping, squeezing, licking. Watched as he put more strength into a particular volley of thrusts, seeing her entire frame rock and shake, her breasts shuddering like delicious fleshy gelatin. It didn't take long until Sinon came again. The sensation of Kirito plunging into her body like that, giving her the feeling of being filled and stretched in all the right places, set her off and made her as slick and hot as Kirito's artful demonstrations of his tongue between her legs. She squealed, and continued to squeal when more orgasms rocked her frame, Kirito's thrusts unrelenting. He loved fucking her through her orgasms, feeling her inner folds clench and undulate in alternating apertures, grips that squeezed and unclenched in inviting variations of tightness. Kirito shuffled his feet forward, grunting through gritted teeth. He let Sinon's useless legs drop at his sides, deigning to grip her waist, clutching the simulated heat of her flesh. He fucked her in earnest, Sinon's slick back starting to slide more easily on the wood of the table, her moans slipping more easily from her throat. Louder, louder still, screaming when she would come again, turning into a puddle of shivering, convulsing heat. Her hands found purchase with the wooden edges of the entertainment system as Kirito began to pound into her. She felt his eyes boring into her body like bullet lines, feeling their heat sear into her skin like stray optical rifle beams. Virtual sweat flew from the tips of her teal hair as she arched her back, squirting more cream all over Kirito's abs. The devilish grin on his face had long since faded, replaced with a determined grimace. His cock throbbed and swelled with an abundance of nerve-frying arousal. He didn't care about any other ploys or plots. All he wanted and needed now was to come inside this teal-haired minx, filling her with the lust that festered all over his body when he wasn't inside her. It took a few more rapid thrusts, a few more long hungry looks at how Sinon clung to the table, coming and gasping for breath, droplets of perspiration glazing her delicious skin, her swaying breasts, her exposed armpits, the soft curvature of her stomach, the way her thighs echoed every single wanton thrust before Kirito finally let out a growl, and made sure he stuffed himself to his hilt. His arms embraced Sinon's thighs in a bear hug, bringing her closer to him, dragging her against his body as he felt the tension that had built up in his loins begin to unravel and shed and crack until it suddenly exploded in a spectacular burst of pure sensation, tessellating and crackling across his nerves, feeling as if he was going to de-res from their point of connection, that toe-curling sensation worming and squeezing from that node into every possible nerve of his body. Fuck or a euro broken bar, he said, drabbled. The first wad of cum seemed to ball up before its exist before shooting in a thick rope inside of her. Every spurt of spunk that followed came in a quick filling succession of viscous white. His hips softly and shiveringly continued its cycle, his thighs kissing her ass cheeks as he lost himself to every spurt of semen that rendered him useless, making his knees buckle. This was what Asuna could never offer him. Release that was visceral, pure, raw. Of course, all the spunk that filled Sinon's womb, the cum that began to spurt out and squeeze past the small slit between Sinon's gripping lower lips and Kirito's engorged prick. It was all ones and zero s's, programmed and implemented by designers with too many repressed desires and too much time on their hands. It wasn't real. As Kirito's orgasm began to slowly and gradually decline, as he watched the wads of semen tumble and form small cascades and lakes on the table before dripping in white strings onto the floor, he could see the graphics struggle to keep up, see how this release, as amazing and cathartic as it felt, wasn't real. Never happened. That point merely affirmed itself when his breathing soon stabilized and his cock remained as firm as his lust. IRL, a mind-shattering climax like that should have rendered him out of commission. Let his refractory period mend his libido for at least half an hour. The grin spread on Kirito's lips again, and he knew the grin was curled on Kazuto's lips as well. Thank God that this wasn't IRL. Fake or not, he would take advantage of the game's failure to properly convey sex. He wouldn't be able to do what he was doing now, roughly propping Sinon's thigh up against his chest, turning her body, forcing her breasts to spill over her arm as she started being railed on her side. Fake or not, in the heat and passionate turbulence of their unfettered fucking, the cum that he scraped out with every hard drive of his hips, the cum that splattered onto her thighs and stuck to his abs, dribbling in white rivulets, it looked just as good as the real thing. Fake or not, sex with Sinon just felt better than the real thing. At least, better than sex with Asuna. Considerations and observations of reality versus virtual reality was quickly shaken away with every convulsion of Sinon's virile body as more orgasms crashed through her. The wood of the entertainment center creaked and shook, cracking. Kirito would come again, letting out more shuddering curses as he filled Sinon with more and more spunk. More of that synthesized lust spilling onto the wood before being spilled out in more bubbling dollops when Kirito would begin thrusting again, fucking Sinon into sensory oblivion. Eventually, Kirito's fifth consecutive orgasm spurted into Sinon's welcoming snatch in the rubble of the entertainment system. Their passion, their lust was too much for the flimsy furniture to withhold, and the two kissed and exchanged dribble and saliva as dollops of sticky white pooled around Sinon's crotch, the cracked and splintered wood around their bodies unnoticed, disregarded. The delirium of their frenzy continued on the bed, Sinon taking the reins, squeezing more and more of Kirito's thick goop, her inner folds unquenchable, milking him of his lust. They sat on the edge of the shitty motel bed, ministrations and hard fucking easily beating out the wail of rusty springs. She bounded on top of him, nipples hard and digging into his chest as she sheathed him between her legs over and over, her tongue swirling wildly inside of his accepting mouth, lips sucking at his own tongue, strings of saliva falling in clear curtains around their mouths like the spunk that webbed between her thighs that smacked into Kirito's hips. Her arms embraced his head, strands of ebony swirling and sticking to her forearms as their sloppy embraces of tongues and lips continued to clasp and suck, wetly, heatedly. Soon Kirito's tongue left the slick hot pink between her cheeks. He deigned to start kissing her throat, licking up the beads of sweat that bounced with every thrust she would crash into his legs. She tittered and whimpered in intervals, feeling his gentle caresses as she continued to dig his engorged prick inside of her, letting it spelunk and stretch her pinkness, sliding out wads of sticky cum to be replaced by more hot wads of sticky cum. By the time Kirito's lips found her armpits, suckling on the heat of the filthy smooth nook, Sinon was soon gasping again, feeling herself hiccup and squeal in breathless squeals as fire crashed through her. Kirito kept sucking on her armpit, licking it and tasting the flavor of fake sweat. She should have been ashamed, squeamish. But the way he kept his mouth inside there let Sinon know that he owned her avatar as much as Shino did. And she loved it, loved knowing that this monster she let ravage her was claiming her when everyone else thought he was claiming someone else. It was proof of that sacrilege, proof of their dirty, big secret. Their lips found each other again, and soon enough Kirito, with his hands firmly dug into the pliable flesh of her ass, opened his mouth against hers, letting their tongues slide wetly in midair as his loins tightened and squeezed and loosened and fell apart all at once. More opes of his syrupy lust pumped into her greedy snatch. Sinon clenched, feeling her pussy ripple in echoes of how Kirito's cock throbbed, feeling more white goose stickily pool in with previous loads, flooding back out in layers of sticky, filthy heat. She could hear the cum spurting out in wet spurts from her worn lower lips, like mayonnaise from a plastic bottle. Kirito's moans drifted between her lips in hot breaths, and she opened her eyes, seeing that his own were half-lidded, dark, blissful. She couldn't help but wonder how this moment would feel IRL. Couldn't help but imagine how much more hot his breaths would feel inside of her mouth, how differently his neck would smell as she broke free from his lips to fall forward and nuzzle into him, how content and filled she'd be if the cum that pooled and swirled inside of her was real. They sat there, the longest respite yet as Sinon savored the sensation of just breathing, the wet, hot skin of her avatar sticking against his, her hair frayed and disheveled while Kirito's remained surprisingly straight and silky baroccinational strands that curled in small black circles into the air. Sinon wanted the sensation of warmth and comfort to last forever. But again the pesky realization that they were only in their respective beds with atmospheres strapped around their faces came upon her when her soft kisses of Kirito's skin yielded small graphical imperfections around the ridge of his collarbone. She didn't like that. Being this deep and this involved with him, Sinon, no, Shino, wanted to feel that sensation of it being real again. To forget that reality, as safe as it was, paled in comparison to what Kirito could offer her. She was ready to accept and explore this new reality. This new world of sensation and carnal exploration that she had never even considered IRL, much less delved into. So she made the first move, surprising Kirito somewhat when she cupped his face, leaned in for a quick beck, and slipped his cock out of her. A heavy slurp followed suit, followed by a sloppy cascade of cum to spill between her legs, splattering in splotchy white against the sheets, adding to the puddle between Kirito's own legs. But Kirito's eyes were too busy being glued to Sinon's body. His hand followed her skin, staying in contact until she was too far behind him. She crawled and crawled towards the head of the bed, and soon Kirito's eyes widened at the sight of it. Sinon's ass, the one he had lusted for since he first met her, was all he could focus on. As she crawled, she added an extra sway into how her cheeks shifted, the glorious fleshy globules shining in the dim lamplight. Cum leaked between her thighs, dripping down her legs with every motion she made, leaving a trail of stickiness behind her. After what seemed like an eternity that Kirito never wanted to end, Sinon stopped, and above the curvature of her ass, the smoothness of her back arched like a fleshy sunrise. Above the ivory of her neck, her head turned back around to look at him, expectantly. Her hands braced themselves against the dry wall, palms flat, and a singular eye peeked past the gunmetal hair clip that rested upon her temple. It was half-lidded, and it was accompanied by that dangerous smile that could flatten an entire legion of demons. She kept that smile, and immediately Kirito knew that his admiration of her rump was what she had intended. One more wriggle confirmed it. Like a man possessed, Kirito crawled up to her, drooling at the sight of sweat rolling in jagged zigzags along her spine, at his cum spurting out of her exposed pussy in endless sap-like stalactites. But most of all, his mouth watered at what he revealed when his hand greedily squeezed into the thick, supple veil of her ass cheek, and pulled it aside, her puckered, untouched anus. Kirito didn't let a second go to waste, diving in face first, lips pressing flat against the crevice of her ass cheeks. His tongue, hot and eager with spit, began its work. Sinfully, Kirito ran the line with its tip against her sensitive orifice, feeling her body shudder in subtle excitement. That wouldn't do. One more teasing line before he unceremoniously tried shoving into her asshole, saliva rolling from the base of his tongue, tides of drool slickly crashing into her skin, slithering into the pink tightness of her anus with Kirito's tongue. Sinon squealed, and suddenly her shuddering wasn't so subtle anymore, forcing Kirito to grip onto her ass cheeks harder to keep her still. That was better. She tasted sweet, something Kirito knew was impossible IRL. It broke his immersion for a moment, but the faint taste of Sinon's flesh drove him forward, and he feasted. His tongue eventually managed to completely immerse itself into the tight sleeve of her rectum, squeezed on all sides by inadvertent clenching. Back and forth, Kirito slithered his heated sponginess, tasting every last drop of saliva that rolled back onto it. His hands made deep indentations into the suppleness of her flesh, nails digging hard. Sinon let out whimpers and confused squeaks, the unknown sensation of Kirito's oral exploration of an area of her body that was generally untouched and left alone making her head spin. IRL, Shino herself squirmed, the strange sensations accosting the sensitive flesh of her ass causing her own derriere to have ghostly echoes. Either way, it only took a few minutes until she felt the familiar breathlessness of an orgasm. It was small, not the crashing, thundering tide she felt when Kirito would pound into her, but it was still effective, and it left her catching her breath against the wall. At this point, Kirito's hands were grasping the athletic firmness of her taut stomach, palms pressed and reveling in the way she quivered at every insertion of his tongue. He was using more than his mouth's muscles now, jutting his head forward, his chin smashed into the worn folds of her snatch with every forwards thrust. Another few minutes and Sinon reached a conclusion. She liked it. As strange as it felt, she loved the dirtiness of it, the shamelessness of Kirito's adoration, of his lust for her. She liked it so much, another orgasm rocked her frame, harder this time, sending a few strings of leaking semen to fly out and latch onto Kirito's neck. Just as suddenly as that revelation hit her, his tongue quickly made an exit from her now slick anal passage. But it didn't leave her body. Instead, Kirito pressed it flat against her ass, licking up the beads of sweat that were beginning to materialize, drawing a few circles before he crawled over her, trailing his tongue with him, a thick trail of his saliva marking her sweaty back. Sinon shivered at the sensation, feeling her ass gripped ever tight by Kirito's hands, feeling his tongue like hot wet velvet searing her skin, her shoulder, her neck, her ear. His breath seddied into it, before the tongue that was just wedged between her ass cheeks followed. Sinon whimpered, feeling the tongue trying to dig and scrape at something, anything from inside of her head, but all he found was nothing, leaving behind spittle staining the only hole that had previously been untouched. She turned her head when he exited, feeling a string of saliva glance her cheek. Then, that tongue slipped into the place it felt most at home, her mouth. With her attention occupied, Kirito relinquished one of his hands' grip on her rump, transferring it to the base of his cock, where he took aim, and pushed. It took about 4 tries, with his erection pathetically bouncing off the thickness of her rump, and by then, Sinon knew exactly what he was up to. But finally his engorged cockhead found purchase in that sweet spot nestled in the previously unsullied valley of her ass cheeks. With that, Kirito pushed slightly, lodging it in deeper. It proved too tight a fit, Sinon's defining ass denying him full access. He let a growl reverberate into her tongue as he returned his left hand to its previous position on her bottom cheek, and with both hands gripping firmly, he spread those cheeks open, and thrust. Sinon sputtered, choking on their collective dribble. Breaking free from the kisses all too soon, Kirito impatiently shoved all that he had into her rectal folds. Keikik Knyuro broken bar. Sinon couldn't even finish his name as he hilted himself, every inch burning, searing through her, as she felt filled in ways that she couldn't ever imagine. By the time his thighs softly met hers, she came, clenching around Kirito's buried shaft. He grunted at how fucking tight she was in this particular place, how he could feel the sinews and musculature of her frame more vividly, more rawly. He pulled out, the exit just as hot and just mind-wrenchingly tight, with only the remnants of his saliva before to aid the plundering of Sinon's cramped pinkness. The progress was slow. But it was progress all the same. And soon, Kirito was thrusting into Sinon's ass at an irregular rhythm, hissing, grunting at just how impossibly good it felt. The sensation of it being almost painful was gone, replaced by a euphoria that threatened to raise his BPM to dangerous heights. But he pushed onward, stretching Sinon's asshole for his needs, making sure that this last unconquered crevice of her body was plundered of the pleasures that hotly pulsed inside for him, and him alone. Lust blazed bright and the delirium that started on the entertainment center soon returned in increments, with every hard thrust of Kirito's hips into Sinon's luscious buttocks. His grip turned ironclad on her waist, as his drives into Sinon soon proved to be insufficient for how much he wanted to dominate her, his arms now clenching and slamming her into his crotch. Their skin met in hard smacks, spunk from the sum of at least 9 or 10 loads flying out, splattering between their legs. That spunk would soon jet out with Sinon's keem as Kirito began fucking her asshole in earnest, pounding, pounding, pounding into her, turning her into a breathless mess, letting him take her, own her, prove her that she was everything that was on his mind. His nose dug into the sweaty strands of her short teal, his hot breaths and shivering groans digging into the nape of her neck. His thrusts sped up, rapid, almost inhuman, almost as inhuman as the grip that squeezed, suffocated his cock. His groans turned into pathetic, baritone whimpers as he chanted her name, over and over until cum jetted into Sinon's ass in yogurty blasts, filling up the rectal cavity completely, spilling back out into Kirito's crotch in a bubbling sticky white geyser. Kirito kept thrusting, slurring his curses, his orgasm driving him wild. He heard the sticky white spurt out of her, heard it spill and burst from inside of her like a viscous geyser. Soon ropes of spunk flew above the curvature of Sinon's ass, splattering onto her lower back, forming rivulets of hot white that began pooling on her skin. Kirito kept thrusting. Kirito kept coming. Sinon kept following suit. Spunk and keem flew in sticky arcs through the air of that humid and crummy motel room, latching onto skin, dripping into hot puddles between their legs. With her passage slick with his own seed, the pounding of Sinon's ass was just made that much easier. Soon enough he would fill it with more semen, more dribbling jets of batter burning her inside pinkness, making her squeal and wiggle her ass, prompting for Kirito to keep fucking her into a sweaty, cum-covered oblivion. The delirium continued. And as much as the pleasure proved blinding, proved almost dangerous. It soon became apparent to both of them that it wasn't enough. No matter how hard Kirito would stuff himself into her, how hard he would slap her ass, leaving red handprints and sweat to splatter and sparkle in droplets in midair, the sex slowly began to meld together in a blur of skin and sweat and tongues and cum. The cycle continued as he pounded and pounded. Semen now almost completely covered Sinon's lower back, dribbling down her skin, sticky white frosting her ass, jiggling and sputtering out of her asshole as Kirito's relentless thrusts scraped his loads back out before another few thrusts jetted more cum back inside. Her face pressed against the bed, her ass held up by Kirito's hands, as the fucking almost grew repetitious. They both had long lost count of how many orgasms had taken them over, but they knew it all just wasn't enough. Then, it was Sinon who brought the idea forth when Kirito came for the umpteenth time, emptying his balls, his hot spunk all over her back in searing sticky goo. Sinon, fuck I Christ. Shino a euro broken bar Sinon said in response, her words coming out as a slur. In the midst of orgasm, Kirito could only grunt dazedly in question, spurts of white emptying into her. Call me, NN, Shino a euro broken bar Sinon affirmed. Then, with some effort, she looked back, one eye over her shoulder, just like she had hours earlier before her ass became Kirito's prime, vulnerable prey. Call out my name and keep fucking me, Kazuto. As impossible as it was, just hearing his IRL name caused another orgasm to rock Kirito's frame. He pulled out his cock as he looked at her with a face of desperation, one that was almost pathetic. He turned her over onto her back, spraying streams and streams of semen all over her breasts, wriggling white spunk landing and sticking onto her stomach, dribbling down and covering her belly button. Then, he lowered himself over her, between her thighs, and the familiar tune of the creaky bed springs rang out once more as he fucked her with renewed vigor. Shino. Kirito moaned, looking deep into Sinon's eyes. He swore he could almost see tears, if it weren't for the pure bliss that swirled in the dilated pixels of her pupils. Kazuto. Sinon shuddered, coming and clenching around Kazuto's cock, relieved at how good it felt to have him inside where he belonged. Shino. Kirito pumped her worn pussy full of him again, more jets of white viscidness puddling under them, swirling in eddies of sticky seed. Kazuto. Sinon's scheme expunged much of the cum that stayed stubbornly all along her inner walls, clinging to Kirito's plunging cock. Shino. Kirito's orgasm ensured that his mind would remain unfocused dark on everything other than the avatar before him, and the girl on the other side of it. The presence of their real names unlocked the truth, as much as they buried their lust in Gigio. It wouldn't be truly fulfilled if they didn't consummate it IRL. In fact, just lying to themselves, just leaving these dangerous cravings to fester under supple helpings of virtual cum would just make it worse. It felt good, but it just wasn't the real thing. Still, the novelty of calling each other's IRL names fueled the fucking for several more hours. By the time Sinon and Kirito finally decided to just lie there, naked and sticky head to toe in sweat and cum and saliva, it was the middle of the night. The entertainment center had already reset, the CRT television, respawned. For the first time in what seemed like an eternity, silence permeated the room, and instead of screams and groans and curses, the only things that passed through their worn, swollen lips were breaths. Their lust would return. They both knew this. Wordlessly they looked not at each other, but the ceiling, letting thoughts run through their minds, free and unhindered by the shackles of primal need. What would they do now? Until tonight, both thought that this arrangement was enough. IRL, Asuna and all of Kazuto's friends were none the wiser. Life supposedly went back to normal, as it was before the killings, the bloody ghosts of jeering caskets, but in his heart, Kazuto knew things were different. Very different, and the festering only got worse now, if he was honest with himself. He finally turned his avatar's head, and looked at Sinon, and imagined that it was Sinon. Sinon turned towards him and she too imagined that it wasn't Kirito looking back at her, but Kazuto. She imagined how dirty that would feel, covered in sweat and cum and saliva. In real sweat and cum and saliva, in his sweat and cum and saliva. She grew hot just thinking about it. It was wrong. It was absolutely filthy. She barely even knew Kirito compared to how Asuna knew him. She knew that much. She had no right to intrude upon their lives like this, to take him away when all she wanted from him was sex. For his cock to satisfy cravings she never felt before she met him. So it was to her great surprise and hidden relief that he was the one to ask. "What are you doing tomorrow?" "Nothing." Let's meet up." Sinon's heart pounded, Shino's breath came out shallow. She gulped. "Oh okay, same time? Shino. IRL. My apartment." Sinon almost let out a squeak. Her throat suddenly felt dry. I. "We can't go on like this, you know that." Sinon grew more flustered. "Why yes but. Asuna doesn't matter. She never did when we fucked here, did she? When you begged for me to keep fucking you. But, this isn't real. This is as real as if we did it IRL, you know that. You know all of this, Shino. The only difference is, all of this doesn't feel as good as the real thing. And I want to show you the real thing." Shino swore that her BPM was over 200 at this point. Her breaths were rapid, heart-pounding and fierce. Adrenaline coursed through her as the weight of the situation pressed down onto her shoulders like wrecking balls. Insecurity crept in, and she used that as a defense. Buta Euro broken bar I.R.L. I'm not Sinon, I'm not half as fit, as sexy, as beautiful. You wouldn't want that. Kirito suddenly scooted closer to her, the wet sheets below him squishing as he pressed their bodies together. "But I do. You think I'd come as quick as I did if I thought Shino wasn't as beautiful and sexy as Sinon?" Sinon couldn't speak. Something clawed at her throat, and she couldn't breathe either. "You think that I wasn't imagining it was Shino I was pounding into earlier? When you moaned and called out Kazuto over and over, as I pumped you full of that cum that drives you crazy. I can just imagine the steam fogging up your glasses. That small mouth that's never kissed anyone wrapping around my cock. Your bushy, horny little pussy open and ready for me to shove. Christ, Kazuto, please your Euro broken bar." Sinon gasped, flustered and red, panting. She squeezed her eyes shut. She needed to calm down. The image Kazuto painted was too raw, too visceral, a Euro broken bar, too hot. Kirito grinned, that devilish grin, and let silence fill in the next few moments. Then, "Fine. Don't come to my apartment." Sinon's eyes shot open in shock. Wait. Kirito's lips shoved themselves onto hers. She struggled but eventually gave in as one kiss gave way to two, then three, until their tongues were mangled together, teeth tapping, soft little moans making love between the hot space of their lip locks. When he finally separated, he looked into Sinon's dazed eyes and grinned. "Don't come. I'll come to yours. Same time as today. I'm going to take your virginity, Shino. I'm going to fuck you and prove that you're the one who drives me wild, not Sinon. I'm going to make you mine, and you're not going to be able to walk straight for a week. Same time as today, Shino." Kirito's HUD popped up, and with one click, his body shattered into infinitesimal shards of polygonal glass, leaving Sinon dazed, breathless, and in shock. She stared straight ahead of her, where Kirito had lay, and his words echoed in her head. What should she do? Panic began to flood into her system. All of this was happening so fast, his confession came out too quickly. Sex IRL? How? What was she supposed to do? How was she going to prepare? Then, the words slowly began to replace themselves with thoughts, with images, his images. Of her being stuffed with his cock, just like Sinon kept being stuffed by Kirito's. Of cum barreling down her throat, of semen filling her womb in a hot flood of stickiness, a euro broken bar. Of his lips on hers, of his mouth flush against her ear moaning her name. Of his hands on her tits, of his fingers smoothing down her sides, a euro broken bar. And soon enough, Sinon's body shattered into polygonal shards. And with her amosphere still strapped around her sweaty head, Sinon moaned. Her hands had already slipped under her shirt and her panties, as she furiously pumped fingers inside of her, pinching around flesh that made her squeal. She didn't moan random syllabic pleas of gibberish, didn't moan curses once her fingering, her self-pleasure began to show fruit, no. As Sinon fucked herself, there was only one thing that was on her mind, one name on her lips. A euro broken bar, Kazuto, a euro broken bar. As she brought herself to more and more orgasms before the swirl of unconsciousness brought her under, Sinon realized these precious few climaxes felt 10 times better than the dozens of orgasms she had reached on the other side of a deep dive. And, with a sinister grin, with drool drawing a thin line on her cheek, she could only imagine how good it would feel like tomorrow, when the cock that would slip in between the wet lips of her pussy was real. How good it would feel to finally fuck Kazuto Kirigaya.